Hi, my name is Dr. Peter Holowka, and it's a pleasure to be here with you today. Here's a quick overview. This is a nice visual of my view of educational technology. You have the technology supporting the visual piece, the part that is experienced by students directly. And so I think technology plays an important role. And so here's a presentation about AI and the importance of its governance. A quick introduction, and this is an overview of the presentation. So you'll hear about my professional background, been in IT and education for about 25 plus years now, and a snapshot of cloud computing in Canada with an academic framework, as well as the laws and correlations that really amplify the importance of those laws. And of course, you have the EU AI Act and its global implications, followed by the viability and sustainability of the companies that provide AI, and lastly, customer sentiment. So quickly about my background. I have been in digital transformation for my entire career. This is 2015, and this is the last set of high-stakes exams in our school. And over time, it transitioned to a laptop online testing environment. And that was successful. And so my doctoral research was in cloud computing adoption and IT infrastructure, as well as the leadership of that. So if you're going to go with cloud or develop your IT infrastructure, was it better to go with a shared data center, or was it better to go with the cloud providers directly? And if that was the case, then who would be in charge of the decisions? So there was a leadership and IT infrastructure component to it. So cloud computing, some quick definitions. Unfortunately, because there's so much of this presentation, I don't have time to dive into these directly, but this gives you a quick sense of the research and some of the issues with both cloud computing, which also dovetails nicely with AI. Now with AI, because its compute is so intensive, you really do need cloud for most instances of it. So I'll go over a quick run through of my research, the foundational research, as well as the current experience that I have as an IT leader within the educational community. So data centers, this is what they typically look like: a lot of servers, a lot of compute, and they're massive facilities because of the economies of scale and scope. And so they're usually in geopolitically stable areas. And so Western Canada was where my research was focused on. And you get a sense of how big it is. Now, this is a global phenomenon. You tend to have a large area. And just to give you a sense of Italy fitting within scope of research. Now, my research covered British Columbia, Alberta, and Saskatchewan, and it covered a huge geography. Now, one of the challenges with educational technology and technology in general is that you have metropolitan centers with a lot of people. They're beautiful places, and this is my home in Vancouver. And unfortunately, people know they're beautiful. They live there, and it gets expensive and competitive. And so these are just sort of scenes in Vancouver. And now once you get out of the city, you have more land, more space, but you don't have as many people. And so, of course, it also snows in Canada. And so the answer was to use cloud computing to help support the educational mission. And of course, when things break down, driving across really snow-covered roads made it really hard. So cloud computing really was the answer. That's what I'm going to get to in a sec. So my research that informed my doctoral work and also gave us the framework for organizational innovation adoption is based on a mixed methods, data transformation mixed method, triangulation design. And so really robust process. Unfortunately, again, I can't dive into the research too deeply here because I want to talk about the more current AI topics. But I'll give you a link at the end of the presentation to the full research. To give you a sense of the granularity that informed this research, the demographics were both by province and by size. Again, really, really thorough. Now, this is the conceptual framework that guided it. The part that I want to focus on is the Fromberg and Schillerberg Organizational Innovation Adoption Framework, and that's the white portion here. Now, I'm going to talk about that in a sec, but to give you a sense of adoption in Canada, cloud computing was the dominant approach for IT infrastructure. And again, that fits in nicely with AI because, yes, you can run AI models locally, but for the most powerful versions, we need it as a cloud computing initiative. So the cloud and the AI journeys really are kind of along the same path of access. Now, to give you a sense of the granularity, was cloud, private cloud, versus public cloud versus traditional. Again, Western Canada is really heavily reliant on computing. is another sense of how granular it was. Now, the correlations. Now, the red indicate the strong correlation relationships, and this is going to support the next part, which is going to be the influence of laws on adoption of a technology. Now, this is the Fromberg and Schillerberg framework, 2002. This is organizational innovation adoption, which differs from individual adoption. So individual acceptance is the next part of that, which is outside of the scope of this presentation. Now, this is a quick preview of that individual acceptance. There's a lot of models in the literature, and the article covers that in a little bit more detail. Again, time doesn't permit me to dive into more deeply. Now, the part that was really interesting from this research was that regulatory pressures, so the laws, regulations, were such a huge factor in the decision-making of IT leaders that it resulted in a modification of the Fromberg and Schillerberg. You can see that here with the red lines, regulatory environment. So environmental influences, network externalities and pressures, that in the previous model captured regulatory environment. Regulatory environment was so determinant of IT infrastructure, both because you had to follow the laws, but also then once you had decided to follow the laws, let's say, build a data center in your province because the laws didn't allow you to use services outside your province. Then once you had a data center, you added more to it. So the snowball started developing. So this is a quick sort of midpoint check of this presentation. So you've heard about the professional background, cloud computing in Canada, and now we get to the exciting part. The EU AI Act, and then the applications of education, the GDPR and the Brussels effect, which has the global impact on these EU AI laws. And of course, the viability and sustainability and the stakeholder perception. It's the last. So the EU AI Act and the implications for education. So if you're an academic or you're in the K-12 teaching space, maybe this is not something that you really worry about too much, but it does have a huge impact on what you can do in the class. So this next portion of the presentation is going to discuss how this impacts AI use in classroom systems. So this is a table that's in the journal, in the article that covers the details of the EU AI. I tried to make it less dense, but rather than have you read the slide, I'm going to dive in and just visually present it. And of course, I used AI to help make graphics because I couldn't draw to save my life. So the very first part of this EU AI Act classification system is minimal risk. So there's 4 categories of risk. And so I'm going to talk about what they mean in the educational context with a recap at the end. So the minimal risk category of AI use is basically what we do currently. So this is the spell check, the spam filters, the educational games, things that we pretty much do already, and they require computers which have embedded with them some sort of automation, and we call that AI. So no changes required. Now, the next step is going to be limited risk. This is where you get to do some interesting stuff that's a little bit more future focused. And so you have, for example, AI chatbots. And that's now where you want to tell the person that it's not a teacher on the other end of the computer that's talking to you, it's probably a bot. And that transparency and those good matters. And this is where, again, you want to be transparent and careful. So let's say you're teaching American history and you've got deep fake of Abraham Lincoln explaining things to you. Now, it's pretty evident. But you start getting into a little bit more troubling territory if you want to use Obama giving a speech or Clinton giving a speech. And that's where, it becomes a little bit more tenuous. So that's where disclosure is really key. Now, the next one is where you're starting to do assessment. And so, for example, in our school at Western Grey Academy, we have a science acceleration program. And so maybe currently we use humans to assess students, but if you use AI to assess students, that would be a really high risk activity. Maybe you could do it carefully, but that could be problematic. The AI proctoring, for example, is another area where if you want to do remote testing, you can have cameras examining students, but that's, again, something that you have to approach very carefully. And so this is a category of AI uses in your classes where you have to be really careful, and there's a lot of ways for this good idea to go wrong. The AI grading especially is another one. So for math, maybe that's less of an issue. An example would be generating tests for students who missed a test on a Friday and maybe were selectively absent so they could talk to their friends on the weekend and write it on Monday. I think this is a global phenomenon. Students want to do well, and so they'll take every advantage they can. AI has an opportunity to do multiple versions and answer keys, and so the things that teachers had troubles doing in the past, now that gets resolved. So that's a math case. But if you're marking English essays or history essays, that becomes a little bit more subjective, and that's where it's tricky. We have an excellent school where I work, and the line for admission is far longer than the number of students we take. And so an idea was, for example, to use AI to read essays from applicants of why they're good people that we should take. And again, now that's a tricky one. Now, so you have to handle that very carefully. One of the things that we settled on was we're going to have humans read them. We're going to still have humans be reviewing things in the admissions process, but having an additional reader that's AI-based might be a good check. So rather than having two humans read an admission package, maybe we'll have one human and the AI with the rubric, and if there's agreement, you proceed, rather than having two people involved in this process where there's agreement, you proceed, and involve a third person. If there's maybe now you have a person and AI, and then when you have disagreement, you call in a second person. So this is an efficiency. It's a little bit more systematic. So that would be an example of how you can probably use it correctly, but you can also appreciate that AI marking unchecked with no controls would be tricky. So a nice way of summarizing the high risk things is if there's a determination involved. So if you're going to outsource that determination to an AI system, that could be problematic. And now we have the unacceptable. So this was a fun area to explore, just because of how dystopia it is. So you can do, for example, sentiment analysis. You could have a camera facing your student, and with current technologies, your classroom, and see who's engaged, who's happy, who's not. Or maybe you could direct people to the counseling office if they are not happy. And so that's fairly creepy in my estimation. You could also do attendance tracking for your school and campus and follow students endlessly. We have that technology at our school. We don't turn it on. And you could also use AI gaming to try to adjust people's perceptions and views. Then again, those are unacceptable. So there's a spectrum here of things you can do with AI. And of course, I used AI to generate this infographic, which is a nice little recap here, where you go from the low risk green stuff, which is things we're currently doing, spam filtering and educational games like typing tutors, etc. And then you have the slightly more advanced AI chatbot or AI content generation, and then you have the deep fake, where you have to where you should disclose, or it should be evident that you are not speaking to Abraham Lincoln. And then you have the transparency aspect and the caution aspect above, where you have that middle area where it's a little bit more deterministic. I might have to be really careful. And then the top one where just don't do those things. So again, unacceptable risk, that kind of how it's building. Unacceptable risk is the worst category that's prohibited. High risk systems, then where you have to be very careful. Limited risk, where you can be more transparent, still careful, and minimal risk, where not much adjustment is required. So the Brussels effect and GDPR, the General Data Protection and Regulation Act, as well as the Brussels effect. So EU sets the global standard for a lot of policies. Companies don't like having multiple versions. So what they'll do is they'll have a version that's compliant with the GDPR. And the argument of the Brussels effect is that what Europe does impacts the rest of the world, and the rest of the world follows. So the rest of the world will either have a version that is compatible, or they'll just fully adopt the GDPR standards. The other consideration after you look at the laws is the viability and sustainability considerations for your suppliers. So Google and OpenAI are the two leading AI platforms and services offered at the moment. And they have very divergent financial paths. So in my research, what was really interesting was looking at Google's financial picture versus OpenAI's. Now, your IT services that are available to you in your school and your students and your families, those are usually layered. So you might have Magic School, which at the very foundational model uses OpenAI, or you'll have Gemini and Google Classroom, etc. Now, my argument is simple. Use a company that's going to be around financially. Around for a while, and that's determined by the financial picture. So Google, for example, in 2026 is projected to make a $20 billion profit and net income. OpenAI is going to lose $14 billion in 2026. Now, this is because AI is really expensive. In 2028, OpenAI's projections are to lose $44 billion. And in 2029, OpenAI says they're going to be breaking even, contingent upon making $100 billion in revenue. So I am not very optimistic in terms of the OpenAI financial picture. I think that given how expensive AI is to run from a power, hardware, and just IT staffing perspective, it's really hard to do. And so because Google is so diversified, I think they have a path forward where OpenAI really is in a precarious situation. So if you're going to build your school's IT systems, especially in science or in other, whatever discipline you're trying to apply this to, the difference in financial picture between Google and OpenAI is so stark that I personally wouldn't build anything on OpenAI at the moment. And Microsoft uses OpenAI heavily, and Google is doing a little bit better. So as you decide which way to go forward, my recommendation is use Google. Stakeholder perception and cultural shifts into the last really important part of this presentation. And that is the cultural aspects. Make sure that whatever you do with technology matches the sentiments of your community. The worst thing you can do, the worst thing you could do before was maybe leak your private data into the public LLMs. And that was bad. That risk has now, in my estimation, moved down below doing something that is going to offend your parent community. So don't do things with AI that make your families and your students think that you were lazy. And so figuring out what level of AI use is acceptable to your customers, to your families, educational community, that's really important. And so those perceptions as they evolve, like, is it okay to do a performance review for employees using AI? What about using AI for a speech? And does seem inauthentic if you're using AI heavily? Well, I wouldn't use it, for example, for a eulogy or wedding vows or a retirement address. But if I was a English language learner, maybe that softens a little bit. So it's a really tricky area. So be mindful. Now, in conclusion, the three critical things that you need to pay attention to with AI, first are the laws, both explicitly what they allow you to do, but also the network effect of that, where other things that the law said you could use are now influencing your additional purchases. The viability of your vendors and suppliers, AI versus Google. And the last one is customer sentiment. Just make sure that you don't do things that are out of step. Okay. And this is now the access to the full research and the QR codes as well as the URLs. If you want to look into that large cloud computing document study that I conducted at the University of Calgary. And that brings my presentation to a close. I look forward to your questions. Thank you for having me.